Welcome everyone to the Montreal Review of Books launch of our spring issue. It's so great to be here. We have a really great lineup of writers appearing. My wife said, "You guys have some big names for your launch." I said, "Yeah, this is the mRb. Come on, this is a high-class operation here we're running." So yeah, welcome. My name is Malcolm Fraser. I'm the editor of the Montreal Review of Books. I'll briefly introduce you to members of our team. We have Rebecca West, the publisher of the mRb and executive director of ALAC. We have Athena Khalid, who is our associate editor, Emma Talaro, who is our associate director working with Rebecca. And we have Selena working the tech. And of course, we have our guests, our fabulous guests, Dimitri Nasrallah, Heather O'Neill, Nalini, Mohabir, and Ronald Cummings, who I'll introduce in more detail in a little bit. We have people joining us from various places in the world, and we're thrilled to have you here. But I want to begin just by saying that we at the mRb are gathered in a place known as Jojaka in the Ganyangahaga language and Muniang in the language of the Anishinaabe. Our association represents a diverse community who live and work on the territories of many indigenous peoples, including the Ganyangahaga, Abenaki, Anishinaabe, and Huron-Wendat. As a publication that celebrates local books and writers, we want to acknowledge the first storytellers of these lands. And I want to say that let's keep the ongoing project of reckoning and reconciliation in our minds, even as we're preoccupied by other things going on in the world. And at the mRb, we try our best. We strive to do better all the time. I want to thank the sponsors of the mRb and this event, Canadian Heritage, Canada Council, and SODEC. I want to welcome everyone joining us. Please feel free to keep your cameras on so we can see each other's faces. Of course, you can also keep them off depending on your comfort level, no pressure. And after the readings, we're going to do a Q&A. You can ask your questions in the chat thread, or you can raise your hand virtually using the Zoom function, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. So I think that we can begin. I want to welcome our first reader, Dimitri Nasrallah. He's the author of 4 novels, and the latest one is HOTLINE, which is spotlighted in a great feature interview by Amy Sands-Rodoff in our new issue. I want to just briefly hold up our new print issue. I'm very happy about the way it turned out. It's got a great, fabulous cover by Julie Doucette. Julie couldn't join us for tonight's reading, but we do have an amazing lineup. And I'm sorry, I've just got off track. I was talking about Dimitri Nasrallah and his new novel, HOTLINE. Dimitri just launched the book a week or 2 ago. He's an internationally acclaimed author. He's got nominations for CBC Canada Reads, the International Impact Dublin Literary Award, the Grand Prix du Livre de Montréal, and the Hugh MacLennan Prize for Fiction, McCausland First Book Prize. We're very honored to have him here. So Dimitri, the floor is yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I see that there's 35 people in the room, so I'm glad to have you all around. I wish this was not a virtual stage and a real stage so we could actually all interact in person, but we're in the twilight of our Zoom years, hopefully, and so we'll take this occasion to enjoy this evening together. The book I'm reading from is HOTLINE. It is, as Malcolm said, my 4th novel, which makes me feel old when I think about it, actually, now that I've almost been at this for 20 years. at this point. It is a story that is very loosely based on my mother's experience when we moved to Canada in the mid-'80s. HOTLINE tells a story of a single mother moving with her son to Montreal in the mid-'80s. She's escaping the civil war in Lebanon. Her immigration was fast-tracked here based on her ability to speak French. She's a French teacher, and so she has that professional designation. But once she arrives here, Muna Haddad, that's the character's name, realizes that no one's going to employ her as a French teacher here because it's practically impossible as a foreigner or a newly landed immigrant to get a job teaching French in Quebec, or at least that was the case in the 80s. There are still some repercussions for today that we might discuss later on. So she can't find employment in her chosen field. Muna is forced to take the only job that will accept her, which is a hotline operator at a weight loss center called Nutrifor. So the section I'm going to be reading from right now is one of those calls. It's halfway through the book. And just to give a sense of how she goes about her daily work and how delicate it can be dealing with strangers on the phone who really think of you as someone else. So I'll just pick up right here at the top of this page. It's not until later in the week that I finally have some time to call back my existing clients. Sylvie Leduc from In Brossard is first on my list. She's been on my mind ever since we last spoke in early December. Her husband was an issue, I've written in my notes, and her story stayed with me. I try not to think of my clients, and in most cases, that's not a problem at all. But there are a few among them who pull me into the theater of their lives as soon as they answer the phone. Bonjour Sylvie, it's Mona from Nutrifor. Am I catching you at an okay time? I hear her turning down the volume on the TV in the background. Yes, Mona. I'm just having my afternoon coffee. Happy New Year. Did you have a good holidays? Yes, it was nice, Sylvie says. Is that indecision I hear in her voice? She sounds like she wants to talk, but she doesn't know where to begin. It's up to me to ask the right combination of questions. I find it a bit boring now that it's all over, I say with a little laugh. I like getting back to normal, Sylvie says. It's such a spectacle every year. Have you stepped on the scale since the new year? Mm-hmm. And 236. The brightness in her voice spills over into sadness. Listen, it's okay. You have to forgive yourself the slips during the holidays, I say. We talked about this, remember? The holidays are a special time. It's okay to take a break for a bit. 12 pounds is a lot, Sylvie says, sounding as if she's wiping a tear from her eye. All I can think is how long it took me to lose it. It's just so hard sometimes. I have to think carefully about what I'm going to say as soon as I hear a client become emotional. If I misjudge the next words, Sylvie will step back and push me away. I understand your disappointment, I say. It's too bad that we can't always live up to the standards we assign for ourselves. But we can all do with a little forgiveness when we look in the mirror. I can't even look at myself in the mirror anymore. Sylvie is sobbing now. Do you want to know how my holidays went, Mona? Can I tell you something I haven't told anyone else? Mais oui, Sylvie. Everything we discuss here is confidential. Do you know what my husband told me over the holidays? He said he was cheating on me. Again. He said again. This whole time, I had no idea. He said the first time had been a mistake, but this time it wasn't. I just smiled at him. I was so shocked at what I was hearing. It was Christmas Day, and his parents, his brother, and his family had all just left our house after I'd slaved over a big turkey dinner for them. The boys were off in their rooms, and he was sitting at the kitchen table with another scotch in his hands as I was collecting all the plates and glasses from around the house, you know, getting everything over to the sink so he could watch me do his fucking dishes while he told me I wasn't good enough for him to even tell me I'm not good enough. He got upset at me for listening like that, for saying nothing at all and scrubbing a plate, as if my not responding to him confirmed I was dumb. And so he said he'd been acting this way through our marriage. He said he couldn't act anymore. He said he was ready to tell me now because he was convinced it was my fault. He said I did it to myself. I felt so humiliated. This is horrible news, Sylvie. I cannot begin to imagine what you must be feeling right now. I wouldn't wish it on you for anything, Mona. Go on, have a good cry. I'll listen. It must be such a relief to say something, just to let it out. You know what irritates me the most, she says, crying openly now? That bastard doesn't deserve my secrecy. He doesn't deserve you, Sylvie. I just feel so trapped by it all. Where do I go from here? Do I break up my family? Do I lose this house? I love this house. I don't want to even imagine what this will do to the boys. They're learning to hate all women because of him. You're strong, Sylvie. You're the foundation of your home. It goes wherever you are. Don't give up on your boys. You have a bond with them that he can never replicate, and they will always respond to your love. As for your husband, he's lost his way. There's something inside him that's broken, and instead of fixing it, he'd rather look across the table and blame you. He said I do nothing for him anymore. He doesn't recognize the girl he fell in love with. You gave him 2 children, a home, a center from which he could stray. He doesn't know what he's losing. Mark my words, Sylvie. It is you who will come out of this a stronger person. I'm glad someone thinks so. I really do, I say. Ya Rabbi. It's always so hard in these moments to back away and remind myself that I'm not a friend, but a phone consultant. My job is to find a way back to the weight loss program without losing her, to keep Sylvie on track so that at least one ambition in her life remains stable for the moment. So finally, I say, think of your diet plan as the first step to making him see that you are better than him, that he's the one who's lost his way. This time, it doesn't work. She's no longer paying me any attention. I listen to her weep and I do my best to console her. And then we make plans to speak again in a few weeks. After the call ends, I genuinely don't know how I'll find the strength to return to this telephone or my next client. I look at the receiver in its cradle with genuine fear. The intensity of calls like Sylvie's causes me to lose sleep. I can't see the purpose in what I'm doing. I can't help. I can only listen and offer a few words, then mail some boxes. People's lives here are easier and harder all at once. They're never at risk, but their safety and stability can turn into a cage. They're free to pursue their dreams, but they're held back by the responsibilities that come along with them. I hear it in all their complaints: schedules, kids, spouses, work, extended family, and they begin to gain the weight. Then there is an ad in a newspaper or magazine to contemplate, maybe bookmark or tear out, and someone to talk to if you muster the courage to pick up the phone and call. But the big joke at the end of it all is the person you'll talk to is me, someone you would never talk to in a million years. Ya Rabbi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. So cool. I have a lot of things I want to ask, but I'm going to wait and do the Q&A after we've done the readings. Thank you so much for that great little preview. It just makes me want to read it even more. So I'm going to move on to our next guests. when we were selecting the books for this issue, this seemed like a no-brainer to cover. The book is called The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation, talking about a really important and not forgotten, but I would say significantly neglected part of local history, an important part. So we said, yes, for sure, we're going to review this. And our writer, our fabulous writer, Erin McLeod, longtime mRb contributor and author in her own right, wrote to me at one point and said, I think this needs to be a feature interview with the authors. Now, any writers out there, that this strategy does not always work to suggest it should be a big feature rather than a review, just FYI. But in this case, I took a look at it and I said, you're absolutely right. This should be a feature. We have the editors of the volume here. Ronald Cummings is Associate Professor of Black Studies and African Diaspora Literatures at McMaster University in Hamilton. And Nalini Mohabir is Assistant Professor of Post-Colonial Geographies here at Concordia. They are members of the Protests and Pedagogy Collective and the editors of The Fire That Time. And I believe that Nalini is going to read first.
Thank you for that introduction. And I just wanted to say thank you to mRb and to ELAC for inviting us, and for all of you who are joining us this evening. I see many of you are friends and supporters from when we first started working on this project, which was in 2019, when we helped to collectively organize a 50th anniversary commemoration of the largest student protest against racism in Canada, which took place at the Sir George Williams University, now Concordia, from where I'm speaking to you from. That resulted in The Fire That Time. We're really proud of this collection and think that there's some very significant essays in here. So thank you for inviting us to speak about it. I'm going to read an excerpt from the introduction to give you a sense of why the volume is called The Fire That Time, Transnational Black Radicalism and the Sir George Williams Occupation, and how we're thinking through fire and plantations and connecting it back to Montreal. After 2 weeks, riot police were summoned by the university administration to end the matter. The staircases and escalators were barricaded with furniture to protect from siege, while the police encircled the building. The police entered, some with drawn guns, according to one first-hand account. A fire quickly ensued, ripping through the computer center, destroying it beyond recognition. The fire placed the lives of occupying students at risk, although what was most frequently reported was the estimated $2 million property damage. Smoke from the hall building drew a crowd of white Montrealers who gathered to see the students arrested and shouted racist slurs at those who had escaped the fire, as memorialized in the title of Dennis Forsyth's 1971 edited volume on the event. Forsyth, a Jamaican scholar studying and teaching sociology in Montreal at the time of the crisis, countered the tendency to view this event solely as a localized incident and scaled up the protest to situate it within a wider context of resistance to Canadian imperialist relations towards the Caribbean. Canada held a relatively privileged place within the British Empire as a white settler colony, whereas the Caribbean were plantation colonies built to extract labor and profits, including by Canadian proxies of empire. Redpath Sugar Refinery in Montreal, for instance, began by importing sugar from the British West Indies. As we argue here, the inferno that ended the student occupation of the university's computer center placed Montreal and the Caribbean not only within long-standing colonial relations, but also within a broader geography of Black resistance. Events in late 1960s Montreal had significant transnational implications. Guyanese historian Walter Rodney was expelled from Jamaica after attending the Congress of Black Writers in Montreal, leading to the so-called Rodney riots in 1968, with protests against the Jamaican government's decision to ban Rodney, headed by students at the University of the West Indies. Following the arrest of Sir George student protesters the next year, students in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus mobilized into the National Joint Action Committee to support students here in Montreal and protest against Canadian interests in Trinidad, such as the predominantly Canadian local banks, which hired only white or near white employees. Students in Trinidad and Barbados also protested against Canada's Governor General, Roland Michener, who was on a goodwill tour in the fashion of royal visits to the region, largely symbolic. It is this geography of resistance and resistant knowledge that we wish to theorize here, mapped through fire and through the concept of transnational Black radicalism. The cause of the fire, which to this day remains officially unknown, becomes a shifting variable in accounts of the protest. We're less interested in pursuing the firestorm of controversy behind what happened as a statement of historical fact, although some protesters have pointedly said, why would we endanger our own lives? Instead, we wish to dwell on the interrogative imperative to explore the uses of fire. As the founding site of what we have come to know as the Americas, the Caribbean was where the world encountered each other, and colonizers imposed hierarchies of racial difference and domination, first through the decimation of the indigenous population and brutalities of the transatlantic slave trade, and later through the bound labor of Asian indentures within European-controlled plantation systems. Natural landscapes were carved into monotonous patches of sugar through the forced labor of enslaved Africans. Plantation thinking, that is white supremacy, justified a coerced and controlled labor force on the basis of time sensitivity of processing sugarcane, which required burning the cane fields before harvest and quickly delivering the cane to the boiling house before it fermented. However, burning cane fields could quickly move, quote, from being useful to becoming dangerous, unquote, as Bonham Richardson, the geographer, notes, resulting in fears by white minorities that fire provided a cover for sabotage or rebellion on the plantation. Thus, fire is rooted in geographies of the plantation system and Black diaspora histories as a signifier of possible revolt, threatening the white version of social order. For enslaved populations across the Americas, fire was agency. Afua Cooper makes the case that Marie-Joseph Angelique, an enslaved woman in Montreal, deliberately set the fire which swept across the city in 1734 as an act of resistance. Building on this history, Kai Kello, in his foreword to this volume, suggests the fire makes Montreal resonant as a space that transcends North American provincialism and highlights how Montreal's history of fire, the fires of 1734 and 1969, situates it in relation to the Caribbean. This volume asks us to recall Montreal's specific place within Black geographies of protest. Fire also spread rapidly. For instance, during the Haitian Revolution, fire also spreads rapidly. For instance, during the Haitian Revolution, similarly destroying the infrastructure of white rule, that is, plantation buildings and cane fields. As Richardson wrote, one can hardly conceive of a slave insurrection without a backdrop of flames. And accounts of fire in the Caribbean newspapers perpetually carried a tone of underlying suspicion. The orange glow of burning cane fields following the harvest provoked anxiety over either rogue or rebellious fires. The colonial suspicions continued until British emancipation in 1834, and they were not without basis. The Christmas Rebellion in Jamaica, 1831, led by Sam Sharp, was announced with fire on the Kensington Sugar Estate in the parish of St. James. The estate was located on a hill, and fire served as a beacon for others to join the struggle for freedom, even as rebellion was ended with brutal suppression. After 1834, the use of fire continued as a signal of celebration, with torchlight parades to mark emancipation and the renewal of life and possibility, such as Trinidad's Cannes Brûlée, from the French Cannes Brûlée celebrations. However, such celebrations were opposed by colonial officials, alarmed by exuberant, quote unquote, urban mobs who reawakened memories of the Haitian Revolution. Despite a long history of entanglements in transatlantic networks of slavery and trade that historians like Afua Cooper document in this volume, Canada is often imagined outside of networked geographies of the plantation system. Indeed, if, as we have argued here, these geographies are marked by associations with fire, then Canada's quintessential imaginative and literary construction as a land of snow articulates an opposite geography. Associations of the Great White North with purity and untouched land, a product of settler colonial imagination of frontiers, or as a wonder landscape of leisure pursuits such as skiing, hockey, skating, are all far distant from the histories of tropical laboring bodies. This geographical imagination is both a deliberate separation and erasure of connections. Under colonial rule, one of the notions perpetuated by Western ontologies was that Western geography, temperate climate, flora, fauna, etc., was meaningful to all, such as the practice of marking seasons or marking time through 4 seasons. Kamau Brathwaite, the poet, foregrounded the insidious nature of colonial pedagogies which lingered in the Caribbean even after independence. School children in the Caribbean were taught about snow through imported books rather than about the surrounding local environment and landscape. Brathwaite shares a creative way in which one child reconciled this foreign geographic imaginary and made it her own. A schoolgirl wrote, quote, "The snow is falling on the cane fields," unquote. What if we were to learn from this girl child and reconcile the submerged history of the so-called Sir George Williams affair along similar lines? Kello's poem Sentences, that opens the volume, urges readers to consider, quote, "The students that sit at the feet of cane stalks sit at the feet of the enslaved and learn that snow hisses down in sentences." What if the cane fields were burning in Montreal? Cannes Brûlée. In other words, how might we take our cue from Brathwaite and Kello and locate Canada not solely within a geography of snow, but rather an interconnected geography of fire? Thank you. And I'll turn it over to my co-editor, Ronald Cummings.
Let me also say thanks to the team at mRb for the invitation. So Nalini read a little bit of our introduction, which situates the question of fire central to the volume. I'm going to also read from the introduction, but I also wanted to include some meditations on not just the title, but also the subtitle, thinking about transnational Black radicalism as a sort of organizing idea for the volume of essays. So in our work, we turn to James Baldwin's classic text, The Fire Next Time, as a touchstone for any discussion about the social symbolism of fire. Fire runs throughout his personal discourse and reflections. In Down at the Cross, it is there in the sense of religious prophecy of fire and brimstone, the fire of sexual tension, fire as torture and cruelty, fire as dynamic energy, fire as the opposite of doubt, example, where there is smoke, there is fire. A central question propelled by fire that undergirds his essay, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? His writing notes the distortions, anxieties, and psychoses of white America at the thought of Black freedom, and attends to Black survival in the face of violent resistance to integration. For this reason, his essay is read primarily within a US national context. However, despite the turmoil of the 1960s US, Baldwin was also reflecting on a wider scale. So Baldwin refused to accept the continuation of a colonial logic that held Western nations and its citizens as superior anywhere in the world. And in his book, The Fire That Time, he inclusively gestures towards to the united struggles of colonized and subjugated regions of the world, including Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. He ends that essay with the resounding line, "God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time." Baldwin's fire has a dual nature, becoming both a powerful call for radical change, implied is a hopeful note that change is possible, and illuminating a warning. The religious discourse of the phrase, borrowed as it is from Black spiritual discourse and song, also resounds in the Rastafarian call of fire, as in fire upon Babylon, which hails condemnation in a biblical sense, the damnation of Western colonial systems. This sound of and sensibility of damnation can also be heard in the dread music of the times. In 1969, for example, Desmond Dekker and the Aces' song Israelites climbed the charts worldwide, situating Black people, and in particular Caribbean migrants in diaspora, as laboring in Babylon. The 1973 Wailers albums, Catch a Fire and Burning, also vividly invoke the discourse of fire and Babylon, and in a kind of way might be heard as part of the soundtrack for the times, amplifying Baldwin's warning about a decade before about the burning desire for social change. A few years after Baldwin published The Fire That Time, American cities like Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore burned in civil rights protests and urban rebellion. In short, fire marks the potential for radical societal transformation and unprecedented change. However, fire doesn't always symbol hope. We use the concept of transnational Black radicalism in our work to extend studies of Black power analyzed and understood through the lens of the nation state. This critical framing allows us to emphasize multiple points of contact, connection, and influence between the events that unfolded in Montreal in 1969 and the Caribbean, but also the US and other spaces, and allows us to trace this moment of struggle in a more expansive way. While others have examined Black power and liberation movements across the Caribbean through international resonances, these efforts connect back to familiar circuits of geopolitical domination and relations, primarily the US or the UK, largely excluding spaces like Canada from Black power imaginaries. The approach we offer here embraces what Ronald Walcott, in his critique of the centrality of nation to the Black Studies Project, has termed a diaspora project of reading. For Walcott, such a reading practice might disrupt the centrality of nationalist discourses as it stands by putting on the agenda new and different positions and conditions for thinking. He demonstrates the usefulness of this by engaging a provocative yet productive reading of Dana Inkster's film, Welcome to Africville, foregrounding queerness in relationship to the story of Black Nova Scotia and Africville. This allows him to explore the multiple intimacies of Black queer diasporas in ways that refuse easy binary narratives of success, respectability, or victimhood. Instead, Walcott calls for keen and probing attention to how the more difficult and intangible moments of interiority, sensibility, and political utterance play out in localized and transnational political alliances, desires, pleasures, and disappointments. In thinking with Ronaldo Walcott, we note that the demolition of the Black settlement of Africville in Nova Scotia and the Sir George Williams University protest in Montreal happened in the same year, in 1969. Yet these, while Africville indexes a relationship with land, and thus in many interpretive frameworks becomes a way of understanding Black presence within the boundaries of the nation states. within the boundaries of the nation. The Sir George Williams protest might be read as a story of transnational political alliances, of diaspora, and even deportation. In many ways, this unsettledness that we signal provides a useful way of engaging and accounting for its easy disappearance and absence from accounts of familiar itineraries of struggle. But we also note how approaching this history through a framework of transnational Black radicalism holds space for multiplicity, for dissent, and divergences. If state narratives are embedded with demands for singularity, we contend that this alternative framework potentially provides an interesting positionality that allows for the indexing of multiple departures, intersections, and relations. The story and its impact exceeds the Canadian nation state and its narrative-making processes and preoccupations. This commitment to multiple locations and perspectives is evident in different ways throughout the chapters in this book, and we read the contributions to this volume as offering three particular ways of engaging histories and itineraries of transnational Black radicalism. So here we see different mobilities of people, the mobility of ideas, and reactivations of time as central to the temporalities and spatialities of transnational Black radicalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Ronald and Nalini, for those great readings, giving us a lot to think about. And thank you so much for your book. I hope that everyone gets a chance to check it out. Well, without further ado, I'll move on to our next and final reading of the evening from Heather O'Neill. Heather O'Neill is a Montreal-based novelist, short story writer, and essayist, winner of CBC's Canada Reads and the Danuta Gleed Award, shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award, the Orange Prize for Fiction, and the Scotiabank Giller Prize 2 years in a row, and author of the new book, When We Lost Our Heads. Heather, the floor is yours.
Hi, thank you everyone from mRb for putting this together, and everyone, and Dimitri and Nalini and Roland, your readings were fantastic. I'm just so, I'm totally getting your books. It was like, I need to know what goes on the next pages. So my book is a novel called When We Lost Our Heads, and it is, I decided to tell the story of the French Revolution, but told in Victorian Montreal from the perspective of a bunch of young women who were all sort of inhabiting the principal characters of the French Revolution. But more than that, it is the story of Sadie and Marie, who are the two heroes of the novel and become friends when they're young. And they're the heroes, but they're also the villains because they're two little narcissistic psychopaths, and they're based on the figures of Marie Antoinette and the Marquis de Sade. So obviously they're problematic, but anyways, so their excesses and sort of the things they get up to start this revolution where the people from down below, the women from down below who live at the bottom of the hill near the river, which I call the Squalid Mile, come to put an end to them. So I'm just gonna read it's actually short, but it's just the first chapter. If I read too much, I always get existentially depressed. I'm like, what is this crap? So I'm gonna read just shortly before I can get sick of myself. This is called Chapter 1, The Duel. In a labyrinth constructed out of a rose bush in the Golden Mile neighborhood of Montreal, two little girls were standing back to back with pistols pointing up towards their chins. They began to count out loud together, taking 15 paces each. Marie Antoine and Sadie Arnett had met in the park on Mount Royal behind their homes when they were little girls of 12 years old. It was 1873. The two of them seemed to have been born with the same amount of thick hair on their heads, except that Sadie had dark brown hair and Marie's was blonde. Sadie had large dark eyes that were almost black, cheekbones that were already high, and lips so dark red they looked as though they had makeup on them. Marie had blue eyes and a complexion that looked porcelain and a mouth that was the lightest pink. It was almost as though they were two dolls that were being marketed to girls, one fair, one dark. That day, Marie had on a white tailored jacket with blue embroidery down the sides. It fell just below her knees, revealing her white stockings and pretty blue leather shoes. Sadie had on a burgundy hat with a black ruffle. It was about the size of a cupcake. It was propped on her head uselessly, but at least it didn't take away from the impression her black velvet coat with burgundy buttons made. She had small black shoes with black bows on the toes. The pistols had roses engraved on the handles. A maid looked down from the second-story window. She was buttoning up her chemise and whistling. From her perspective, she could see into the labyrinth and its clearing in the middle. At first, she doubted what she was actually seeing. It did not seem possible at all. There's always something surreal about children embarking on something dangerous. They are oblivious to the danger and act as though they are about to defy all the laws of physics. For a moment, the adult is suspended in the realm of childhood disbelief. But the maid broke the spell. She ran down the stairs with only her drawers and her chemise undone. Her red hair flew behind her as though she were carrying a torch. She ran out through the labyrinth screaming. Finally, she arrived there. She stood in the middle and opened her mouth to tell the two girls to stop at the precise moment they both spun around and fired their guns at each other. As the two bullets hit the maid and she fell to the ground, the words alerting the girls to their idiocy were forever silenced.
Thank you, Heather. That's definitely a teaser that makes me want to read more. I'll start. If anyone wants to ask questions, as I said earlier, please feel free to put them in the chat thread, or else press the raise your hand button and we will try to get to everyone. But I'll start, since you just read, Heather, I'll ask you first. I'm curious, in your interview with Yara El-Swady in the new mRb, you talk about the novel being inspired by an image of a ball being held on a skating rink. And that made me curious to know more about what happened in between seeing that image and coming up with the idea.
It was one of those things. I was kind of interested in this. I had been playing with the idea of telling two different time periods in one. It was just something that was going through my head as a sort of construction and collapsing of time, and then putting a modern spin on it. And then I saw, I think, it's hard to remember where the origin, but I did see, I was looking through this book of images from, the Industrial Revolution or Victorian era, whatever you want to call it, in Montreal. And I saw the skating ball with everybody dressed up in costumes, and a lot of people had on costumes from the French Revolution, which was very popular among aristocrats to kind of dress as these other aristocrats who had lost their heads and whatnot. And so then I saw this young girl dressed as Robespierre, and I really wanted her just to be Robespierre. And I had always, I had always been interested in the French Revolution. It was something that I had read about since I was a little girl. There was something about that dynamic of the power of words to kind of launch this revolution, and how revolutions based on text so often can just explode the meaning and go in different directions that you can't control. And I also like they were so characters out of fiction. They were so grandiose and beautiful speakers. And I had loved Robespierre, this idea of an orphan who had kind of catapulted himself and managed to get into the company of kings and queens just by virtue of he had this amazing ability to speak and write poetry and just attract everyone's attention. He was just this little kind of you know, it's almost like a child actor. It was carted out. And then with this proximity he had as a child, he just carried on and sort of took over France and just became a lunatic and lost control of his, you know, lost the plot of his own revolution. So I was very interested in that, but I never had a way to engage with it because as a woman, their characters, what they were professing was so, it was just for men of the time, and women's rights went backwards. So I was just like, I'm going to make them young women and see how they would articulate those values and what they would mean in a feminist context. And except for, of course, the Marquis de Sade. And then I was just so interested in his idea and philosophy of the bedroom and the philosophy of ultimate freedom, how a woman might express that. So I don't know if I've answered your question, except that I saw this drawing, and then I had the idea, and I have like this quote from the director Michel Gondry on my bulletin board, and it says, if an idea is ever really great, it's on the brink of being stupid. And I was like, that's an idiotic idea, but so it might be good. So I went with it.
That's great. I'm going to remember that quote. Thank you, Heather. My next question is for Ronald. Obviously, your book, your and Nalini's collection that you edited talks a lot about history. And in the interview you did with Aaron McLeod for the mRb, you said some of this work was not just about recuperating history, but also trying to think about questions of what we can do with this history, and not in a prescriptive way, but in a generative way. And I wondered if you could just expand on that a little bit and tell us a bit about what you mean by a generative way.
So as Nalini mentioned, we had organized this conference in 2019. So we have been working on the book post 2019. And of course, this also coincides with a period where we've seen lots of protests about Black rights, about colonial histories, about what it means to live with colonial histories and in the shadows of colonial histories, about statues and representation and memory. And so we were also grappling with those questions as we were working on this volume. And so were our contributors. And so it felt like there was something generative happening in the collective sharing and return to this history. But in that return, it wasn't just a return to the past, that so many of the questions of the present were the questions that the students in 1969 were grappling with. These were students who were coming from newly independent spaces, right, that had just come from under colonial rule. And they were trying to engage with that question of what freedom means and what it felt like to be free. And it seems as if those are questions that we're still grappling with in a fundamental way. And so for us, this book is about the past, but it is also speaking to the present in dynamic ways. And so that's kind of what I meant, that, that I think there's something generative about returning to that history for what it teaches us, but also what we can do with that history in terms of not repeating that history, but also what are the fundamental questions that remain unresolved related to that history. And also for us, the sort of collective spirit of protest that was part of the event was something that we thought was meaningful to continue to engage with and to think about.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a related question for Nalini, but also in the interview, you say, quote, in this moment where we're reckoning with what does it mean to have these histories directly on our campus and to have a new dialogue about it, what it might mean. So can you tell us a little bit about what it means from your perspective?
I'm really echoing what Ronald said, but there, we open the book with the foreword by Kai Kello, which is dated 2019. So from then to now, of course, a lot has happened, and quite literally Minneapolis was burning with rage at George Floyd's murder as we were working on this collection, and the Black Lives Matters protests were occurring in the summer of 2020. So there was this racial reckoning that radiated outwards, that were connecting different places and helping us to think about what are the legacies of place, like how an event happens in one place, then resonates, in different cities or through different diasporic networks, and tells us something about what it means to be, a body in place, a body out of place, say in these settings like university campuses. There's that in the section on James Baldwin that Ronald was reading. He references that question that Baldwin asks, do I really want to be integrated into a burning house? And I think that question was important for us to think about what the legacies of the Sir George Williams protests. And for me, that's, I teach on the Sir George Williams campus, and sometimes I teach on the 9th floor. If any of you went to Concordia, in that large auditorium room there, which is where the students were herded into by the police after the fire broke out. And so, that got us thinking about the question of reparations. And I think one of those questions might be, what does that mean in terms of institutional space? What does that mean in terms of infrastructural space? When we're in this moment when we're thinking about Black studies, what commitment to space can the university give Black studies? Not just, one part of it is, of course, recognizing it as a discipline. The other part is, creating the physical space to support the knowledge production.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you both. I have a question for Dimitri, and I want to encourage those of us gathered here to also add your questions. Don't be shy. But Dimitri, I was fascinated right away when I saw the description of your novel, because for me the call center is such a sort of essential but under served part of the Anglophone and Allophone experience in Montreal. And so many people work in call centers when they first move here, but it's not something that, to my knowledge, has been covered much in the literary world. Do you have personal experience with that world, or is it more based on your mother's experience?
I have a grand total of 10 days of call center experience, which came about right after I completed my graduate studies at Concordia. And we're bringing this back to Concordia from some of the other people on the screen. And I'm afraid I have to report that my graduate studies left me woefully underprepared to take on the world of call centers. I did not fare well. But beyond that was all I really took from that episode. Had the difficulty of actually being on these phone calls and of shifting from one person to the next without having a sense of who you were going to be talking to next. The rest of it came from, I just built that experience into this experience that my mother had when we arrived here, where she couldn't actually find work as a French teacher. So she had to end up working at this weight loss center. And so all of a sudden, it was Nutrisystem in real life and Nutrifor in the book. All of a sudden, we had these yellow boxes of food showing up in our house all of a sudden. And so I became fascinated with these boxes. And for some reason, they stayed in my memory for a good 3 decades or so. And I found myself continuously returning to them. So after I finished with my previous book, which was The Bleed, in which I imagined a family of dictators in an imaginary country. and I managed to pull that off in a rather sincere manner. I asked myself, why can I do that but not write about my own mother in a sincere manner? And I began to wonder what was there and why I hadn't written about intimacy in a way before. And it was a question that began just once it locked into my head, I couldn't get it out. And I was like, I have to find a way to work with this. And the hotline seemed to be a perfect vehicle to pull that off. And then the pandemic hit, and the premium on intimacy really went up quite high. We all of a sudden found ourselves quite isolated, and everyone was yearning for some kind of connection to other people. So it seemed like the moment was right to use this vehicle of a hotline to eliminate that visual element that we unconsciously associate with everyone we meet and see, and just bring people back to their voices and to see what people who are discriminated against in every other walk of life can find within each other once you eliminate the sight and just bring it down to the voice and that connection that can be made. And that's something of the goal I was aiming for.
Cool. On another note, you talked about your mom and the character inspired by her struggling to find work in her field as a teacher in Quebec. From your perspective, have things improved or changed here since those days, or do people still face those struggles?
Well, this is where I'd come back to the term that Ronald presented earlier on, generative history. And I feel we're still dealing with the same permutation of the problem. It's just wearing different clothes right now. And so, whereas back in the 80s, the conduit may have been a Bill 101, certainly the ramifications are here in Bill 21 and the situations we see. So, I don't know, maybe Heather can speak to this as well, but whenever I approach a historical subject, and by now I look at the 1980s as a historical time period, I can't help but wonder what's the connection to the present moment. Why do I want to tell this story from the 80s now? So why is it pertinent? And unfortunately, I think we can all recognize that those systemic barriers are still there in society, and that those people who do manage to find a way through them, especially for marginalized communities, for immigrants, it's on a situational level. It happens through other individuals and the kindnesses of communities, perhaps, but it's not happening because they're overcoming a systemic barrier through the system. They found another way around. And I think that's something I wanted to get across in the book, that people do aspire to greater things, even though there are barriers in their way. But the way around is really on a one-to-one basis. And from the people that I've known who've managed to overcome such challenges, they've always done it through their own ingenuity and through their communities around them. And that's why I think community is ultimately quite an important feature in our society.
For sure. Talking about those parallels, Heather, you talk a bit about the Victorian era as one where there were these immense gaps between the haves and have-nots. Do you see a parallel to today in that as well?
Well, I mean, yeah, obviously it was like a question of class, and I totally agree with Dimitri was saying. When you kind of work in historical fiction, it's really a way of a scaffolding for looking at a very contemporary problem. And of course it's not, I mean, there's so many things that we don't actually know how people talked or acted, but it's all, you're looking at the past as a way to find keys to the present. And I think one of the things I was looking at feminism because it's right at the beginning of, right before the first wave of feminism and what brought it about. But I was also within that critiquing what has been challenged about feminism today, and it's especially in the characters of Sadie Marie with the difficulties of white feminism or girl boss feminism or whatever you want to call it, this kind of feminism that just pushes one woman ahead, like of a specific class and social background, to kind of take the place beside other white men. So it's like, but what does that do to the patriarchy and everybody else who's like of lower classes or more diverse background? So it was definitely a challenge of that. It was also bringing in the idea of the Me Too movement as a sort of army of young women, and when they kind of became this collective voice, particularly of young women, so many people were like, men were so incredibly terrified by that, 18-year-olds on their internet, like who were they going to take down? So it was also had that kind of edge to it. So it was all sort of, I liked the idea of that time, especially for women to kind of have these, I mean, they literally wore cages, like with the crinoline, and that, so I was interested within those mannerisms, how one could articulate the idea of sex and female agency and women communicating with each other. So it was actually, everything was kind of based thematically on questions I had been asking myself and kind of grappling with in the very like current politics.
Yeah, I feel like there are so many shared threads coming out between these books in terms of the generative history, the conflict, and your revolutions, and as Nalini said earlier, the idea of a body out of place. It seems to I'm starting to think that this programming was even more brilliant than we thought. But I want on another topic, I wanted to ask Ronald and Nalini a bit about how the book came together. I mean, it's a very ambitious collection. You've got everything from poetry to quite academic essays to history. And it came about as a result of a conference. Can you tell us a bit about how the conference gave way to the collection?
I'm gonna let Ronald answer that question, but just before I do, I just wanted to come back to this really interesting conversation about the way the past resonates in the present. And I'm sure many of you probably saw that NFB documentary on the Rose family, where there's this moment that caught my attention where there's an interview, I think, with the uncle talking about the discrimination within the Redpath sugar factory and how it was humiliating to have to speak English, and how the wages were low, and how, this experience of oppression led to the FLQ. And in watching that documentary, it really made me wonder, like, what would happen if this moment of the FLQ that so centers Quebec history in this era that we're talking about as well, what if that opened up to also think about these other moments like Sir George, and then to think about, where did that sugar come from, and what were the experiences of people who were doing that backbreaking labor, manual labor of cutting sugarcane by hand, loading it onto punts, taking it to the factory before it even reached Quebec, and how, like, maybe we could think about the plantation as a site that, rather than particular to the Caribbean, but might open up this space of connections. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
I mean, maybe that thread of thinking through connections is a good segue to sort of thinking about the book. I mean, one of the things that we were moved by is the way in which this is a story with so many narratives. Like it's really rich for exploration. There were so many people, who were involved in the protest, on the periphery of the protest in Montreal at the time, and so many things that were going on. And so for us, we thought it was important to have a kind of multiplicity of voices, as in, this being a sort of collective effort to revisit this history, but also the question of like, well, what are the kinds of forms, what are the kinds of narrative strategies that we might use to recuperate this history, right? Because it's a history that on one side of it, there is the sort of intrigue of the fire, but there's also the kinds of the trial that followed, the events at the university, but also the aftermath of that, right? And how do we try to hold the expansiveness of this story together? And so the book opens with a conversation with 4 of the protesters who were there in 1969, recounting that event. And so, we kind of thought that conversational entry into the book was a useful one. But also alongside that, we have an interview, we have essays that kind of, we have narrative essays, right, that are much more personal, that sort of like take up individual stories as part of this larger narrative. And then we have the sort of academic essays that are trying to come up with a language to talk about this really complex history. And so part of what you're signaling is the challenge of this history, right? And I don't think that we've exhausted the sort of narrative modes that are a part of this history, but we've certainly tried to explore them in the shaping of this book.
Thank you very much. I want to say, if everyone from our audience, I see a hand up over here. Kirsten, we'd love to hear your question.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, I was just interested in the book, The Fire That Time, how perhaps you've seen the narratives about like the student protest and how it was like repressed, like changed throughout the years. Because I was actually, this is not that important, but like I went to Concordia more than 10 years ago now. And then I came back to do another degree. And then in between, like I was working, handing out flyers for this tutoring center. So I'd be around there. And like from time to time, like I'd see this like come up again and again in the student newspapers. And I was wondering like if you noticed like the way that people talked about that changing, or the different connections that they made to it changing.
I think it depends on what layer of the university we're talking about. So I think for students, keeping this history alive is very instructive to their present day activism. So for example, the Concordia Student Union, which is the undergraduate student union, has training that centers around showing the film The Ninth Floor, the NFB documentary on the Sir George Williams affair. And ensuring, that this history is passed down. On the other hand, perhaps if we were to think about some of the struggles so one of the calls the students made in 1969 was for Black studies. There's still not a Black studies at the university, nor has there been an apology for calling the police on students, or, there's these questions of the reparative work that perhaps has gone a little silent at that level.
I have a question in the chat from Elise. Elise asks, how did you choose Kay Kello to do the introduction to The Fire That Time?
He was instrumental in helping us with the Protests in Pedagogy, the 2019 commemoration, which was like 2 weeks of events, multiple events, every day for the duration of the same time the students had held the sit-in at the computer center. So he was just such a core part of the collective. It made sense to have him do the foreword.
Yeah, and it's also been interesting to see the ways in which Kai has returned to this history in other forms. So in Dominoes at the Crossroads, there's stories which also return to his short story collection. There's stories that return to this history through fiction. So it's also been interesting to sort of, for us as editors of this work, to think about his multiple returns to that history across different forms. And yeah.
Thank you. I've got another question in the chat for Dimitri from Emma, asking, what did it feel like to ventriloquize, if that's the right word, your mom, to imagine or write her dialogue? I'm curious, she says, read this question of difficult intimacy.
Well, that was the part that got the whole project started. I feel like with my previous book, I took on first person for the first time, and it was really freeing. I found that in some ways it changes your perspective to narrative, but it really invests you in a character in a different way. And so when I got started on this project, I started with this sketch, and I ended up writing it in the first person. And this woman emerged who I knew, who I didn't recognize as my mother at first, but had all the features of all these Lebanese women I've known while growing up. This pragmatism, this ambition to stabilize situations. They were all really good at it and really silent and stoic about how they went about it. So I wanted to capture some of that aspect in the voice. And then Arabic started coming into the voice as well. And I began asking myself, well, how much Arabic can I put in here? And this is the part that brought me back to my mother, in that she'll interchange between Arabic and English, and maybe French sometimes even, in any given conversation without even recognizing that she's doing so. And that struck me as a really authentic feature, something I really wanted to capture on the page. So I began thinking about, how am I going to get Arabic into an English language book and have it work so that I don't have to italicize the language or colonize the editing process, I guess is the best way to put it, to like really highlight the Arabic as being an outsider language to the English that's there. So in the end, we decided that we would just let the Arabic run through without italics or any kind of explanation, and really just have it emerge, or have the meaning emerge, as a manner of context and cadence and repetition, to see if the poetics of it could build that way. And that forced me to kind of focus in on, well, what language would a person use repeatedly? And so that connected me back to the way my mother spoke, and with certain words coming up more often than not. And so it was actually quite freeing in the end, once I was able to cross that gender divide, which is obviously the intellectual question that you have at the center of something like this. How am I going to make that leap and have it be authentic in nature? So locking into this voice that was so formative to me ended up being my authenticating feature for developing this voice. And I just got really comfortable with it really quickly, and the story took off from there.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I was fascinated when I read the piece, Amy's piece. She talked about your technique of not italicizing the Arabic, and Athena and I, when we were editing the latest issue, there was another review talking about an Anishinaabe writer, where the reviewer was very insistent that we not italicize some of the Anishinaabe words, and as an editor, I kind of felt like conflicted about that. But do you see, I mean, you Dimitri are an editor yourself, do you see that happening more and more in literature?
Well, I think we can talk a lot about decolonizing the editorial process, and ultimately we can always say, well, let's punt this opportunity down to the next book and let someone else deal with it. But when you're presented with a book in front of you that has these features in it, and the conversation is ongoing around you, it seems like the right moment to lock into that and to decide, well, we're going to make this incremental advancement right now, and we're going to eliminate those italics. And if it throws someone off, well, then maybe we're just going to go into the deep end of the swimming pool and see how things really work out. And most people are kind of happy to go along with the process. I think writers, once they get it into their mindset that they no longer have to italicize these words, that, I mean, this is a true, I guess, the potential of where a kind of egalitarianism can emerge amongst the many intersecting cultures that people have within them as they project onto the page. It's amazing how we create a hierarchy for those feelings in the creative process, and that we subject certain aspects of our work to certain behaviors and not others. So the more I end up working on books with other writers, the more I'm in a position to think about this a lot more. So whereas if I were just doing it on my own for my own work, it would emerge maybe once every 4 or 5 years that I would have to ask this question. But since I'm doing it 4 times a year, at least, it's a question that's ongoing. And I tend to gravitate towards books that are asking these questions anyways. So I find it as part of this like ongoing incremental dialogue that's happening book by book with that's, asking the question of like, what can we use in this book to really push this conversation forward? Because we talk a lot about identity and its politics in terms of the authors present, but there's this whole other spectrum to the process, be it editorial or especially in translation, which is still quite conservative by nature and hasn't really evolved as much because it exists in the shadows. And so part of it is just a question of shining a light on these parts that no one's really looking at, or maybe not looking at enough. And saying, well, just because the spotlight isn't there, doesn't mean we shouldn't really be doing something about it.
So true. I think we're going to do one more question because I see one in the chat that's a very good concluding question from Rebecca. She says, in all 3 books, there is this sense of looking back on past events or looking at a different era through a new lens. Did you discover something that surprised you in this process, whether about the history itself or about yourself? And I'll start with Nalini.
I guess it was a really interesting reminder of the role that Concordia or Sir George Williams University played in 1969, where it like took a center stage internationally. This event was reported in the New York Times and the London Times and so on. It was of course, reported through a particular lens, which was, Canada's most expensive student protest, or more often than not, riot. But there was, in going back and tracing the ripple effects of this moment in the Caribbean, there's this kind of interesting moment where I think, what we're so used to thinking about the uneven dependencies and uneven development and so on in the world, but there's a moment here in which what we might think of as the global South, so the Caribbean, is actually, controlling the narrative here. The students in Montreal are sending reports to Trinidad, to Jamaica. That's being picked up in the newspapers. The students there are taking action. So perhaps it's a moment where the South controls more of the narrative than we thought.
How about you, Ronald?
I think I'm always, in sort of different aspects of my research, I'm always surprised by the vitality of the 1960s as a sort of moment of change and a moment of, there are all these movements that are happening, at the same time. And Sir George, the events at Sir George are certainly part of it. The other thing that I thought was really interesting as we worked on this book, the sort of spaces in which this narrative has survived. There's kind of, like what we think of as history with a capital H, right? Which is the state narrative, which is the narrative that we tell in the academy. But it was, for me, it was the family stories. So, like I tell friends or, people that I meet that, like we were planning this conference or we're working on this book, and they'd be like, oh, my uncle or, a friend of my uncle was at Sir George, right? So I'm interested in those family spaces where this story survived. And it's always an uncle, because the revolution is always gendered as male. But it was also interesting for us going back to this history and also thinking about the women's stories as part of the narrative of the Sir George occupation.
How about you, Heather?
Oh yeah, like so many things, but as Roland was saying, I mean, with any story, like you were saying, Malcolm, how there's these interesting threads. Like even when I was thinking, when Nalini was talking about the sugar, and there's a sugar factory, which kind of represents that story, but that was not my story to tell. And then it's so interesting because there's so many voices that need to tell a story of a place. And so what Nalini was saying, I was like, oh my God, that's like so interesting and fascinating. And it's like all books are companion pieces to each other because everybody has like a limited perspective. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, but when Roland was saying, it was fun to find the certain things that women were doing within the industrial age, because we think of factories as so masculine and all the working, and then but young girls were all employed in the factory. Like after the age of 12 you would go, because you could pay young women, young girls particularly, like we're talking 12-year-olds, less than any other worker. And also they would use their slenderness and their sort of that nimble quality that young girls, that little ballet, to jump inside the machines as they were moving to take out little like pieces of thread or to oil things. So it was an incredibly dangerous job of them leaping in and out. And then I was like, it's so interesting how capitalism just exploits everything. So it had exploited this wonderful winsome nature that little girls physically have, and turned it into this really deadly money-making thing, to just use them as cogs in the machine. And a lot of things. I was really fascinated too in that era when I was researching sex workers at that time, to find that they were in much better health and had much better life expectancy and more agency than other women at the time, particularly mothers. Like mothers just, I mean, I don't know why anybody ever has children in any age, but it was just so incredibly difficult to have this baby. And also in that area in Montreal at the time, for a baby who was born in the lower class area, the life expectancy was only 50%. And that, like, once I had read about that just changed the nature of babies in the novel. And when you have babies, and like we have a child and we expect it to kind of stay with us forever. But that was such a whimsome, troublesome thing, these babies who came and saw and maybe stayed.
Wow. Yeah.
I'm babbling.
No, not at all. There's so much in there. Dimitri, in case.
Sure, yeah, I mean,
yeah.
Go ahead. You were going to reframe that, or?
Just in case you had forgotten what the question was. But,
oh, I remember. I mean, just so I don't tackle it from the large-scale ideological perspective that we've heard already, I'll bring it in a little more individually. And it's always amazing to me that I go back to these yellow Nutrisystem boxes that showed up in our house in the late 80s in the McGill ghetto. And they were always such a novelty item. And it took me over 3 decades to really piece together the narrative around them, of the fact that, my mother couldn't get a job for a particular reason, and that there was a reason that she ended up having to go work at this weight loss center in the first place. And there was this left turn in her life that she doesn't like to really comment on at all ever since. And quite amazing how everything is there for you in a given moment, but we're really limited in our perspective of what we can pull away from it. And it takes so much time to just unpack things. and really see them for the larger picture they're connected to. And from that perspective, I think looking back on history is quite interesting because, I mean, it is being told from a particular narrative viewpoint as it's happening. And we've already explored the fact that that narrative viewpoint comes with different social hierarchies, and different people have more control over different aspects of that narrative. And a lot of what comes after is a process of letting other voices in, and maybe even letting ourselves feel differently about different events that may have transpired in our lives. I go back to the moment where this book was set in the 80s. And for the longest time, I looked at it from the perspective of the angry, slighted child who had to deal with a bunch of personal upheavals at that time. And that was the identity I connected with for a long time until I had a kid of my own and began to realize that they're quite difficult to take care of and to keep stable. And that, like, any little thing can set off a chain reaction that leads to unintended consequences. And that must have been incredibly difficult to do from the perspective of the parent back then, when the circumstances were really out of my parents' control. So time and viewing things through that historical lens personally allowed me to sympathize with the situation, to soften to what had happened, and to be able to see my parents' plight, my mother's plight specifically, through a completely different lens than the one that had really become the foundation of our relationship for 3 or 4 decades. Now, me and my mom are still not the types who are the most expressive with each other. So part of writing this book is the fact that I could just give it to her and say, without actually saying anything, I kind of see things differently now. And thank you for going through the situation you did so I can end up where I am. And I'd rather write it out in 200 and so pages than actually articulate it. So there we go.
Well, we all have our ways, right? I mean, Dimitri, Heather, Ronald, Nalini, thank you so much for this great conversation. I feel like it could go on and on. I feel like there's so many more things I could ask and want to find out, but instead we should all just get your books. Emma just posted in the chat some links to buy them directly from the publisher, or go and get them at your local independent bookstore. I want to give a brief shout out to a couple of people I forgot to mention earlier. David LeBlanc, who's the designer, longtime designer of the print version of the mRb, and Michael Weil, who's our national ads salesperson, made sure that this was a big issue, chock-a-block, full of reviews and features. Check it out at your local library, bookstore, or the coolest cafe. And thanks to our team, and thank you to everyone who showed up. Let's hope that our next launch in the summer is an in-person affair. Knock on wood. Thank you all for attending, and see you around.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.